And let's talk a little bit about some of the scenarios that could play out then, Matthew. There's a chance Johnson could be called on to resign. What would an election battle within the Conservative Party itself look like, or a leadership battle rather? And or could we see a fight in more of an election standpoint, maybe seeing Labour SNP coming through?
Well, firstly, it's important to note that this isn't the only source of disillusionment within the Conservative Party over Boris Johnson's leadership. You've got a lot of disquiet about those tax rises, a dissatisfaction with what they see as his failure to make the most out of Brexit, his relentless focus on net zero and climate change, which a lot of Conservative MPs don't really prioritise, and the absence of any strategy over levelling up, his big policy infrastructure push in Northern England. So the parties are really the latest problem for Boris Johnson. Now, if they do indeed push him into resigning, which is by no means certain, he has long just ignored the public mood and carried on. But if they were to do so, this is also happening at a time when the Labour Party is back in the lead in the polls. If you were to put those polling numbers into a forecast, you'd be looking at the next election at Labour being the largest party without a majority, perhaps in coalition with the Scottish National Party, which of course could in turn raise the prospect of a second referendum in Scotland. And so this would again put British politics back into that volatility that we all thought was sort of over and done with the moment the country left Brexit. So this is not necessarily the end, but it is beginning to feel like the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson.
Well, Matthew, let's say it is the end for Boris Johnson and go down that scenario path. Who is likely to succeed him? Who are the main frontrunners in your view? And I guess it's interesting that markets haven't really reacted much to the goings-on here. And I wonder if that's because even in the scenario where Boris Johnson steps down, whoever succeeds him is likely to have a similar stance on some of the key issues.
Well, I suspect the markets would probably like who succeeds Boris Johnson. The two front contenders, Rishi Sunak, who really is a traditional fiscal conservative, has not been happy with the massive expansion of the state, wants to really, I think, push back on some of the regulations, some of the taxes that we've seen over the last few years, even though as Chancellor, he also presided over those changes. We've also got Liz Truss, a candidate who is firmly committed to Brexit, who really in some ways wants to sort of return to the 1980s, has portrayed herself as a Thatcherite candidate. Now, from a market perspective, I think those two individuals would probably be quite appealing. But of course, what this might also raise the prospect of is a fresh general election. And if the polls are as they are, then actually there's no guarantee that the Conservative Party would necessarily emerge as the victor at that election. And we may end up just as plausibly with a somewhat sort of fragile coalition between perhaps the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP. So really a lot is hinging now on what is going to happen with this revelation, what the inquiry which is underway is going to produce, and also this open question mark about whether the police are going to get involved, because this was clearly a breach of COVID guidelines.
Well, Matthew, you come precisely to my next question, which is around the Metropolitan Police, which are potentially here getting involved, cooperating with the Cabinet Office about a possible criminal investigation into the party. Do you see this potentially resulting in a criminal offense for the Prime Minister? And you know, just everybody remembers what happened with Theresa May when the Tory party miscalculated when they went for an election.
Well, if the evidence is piling up very quickly, there was clearly a gathering. There were clearly dozens of people at that gathering. It was clearly a party with alcohol and music. It was not, as Number 10 have claimed, merely a sort of an association among people who happen to be working in the same office. And if indeed the police pursue this and the inquiry, which is being headed up at the moment, if those both come to difficult and damning conclusions for Boris Johnson, that may well be the end of his premiership. And there was always a question mark over Boris Johnson as Prime Minister about whether he really did, firstly, have a vision for his premiership, but secondly, had the leadership calibre that was required to be Prime Minister. And if indeed those two things collide, he could well be resigning in a matter of weeks. And that, of course, would plunge British politics back into the chaos that we had just got used to thinking we'd left behind us.